Scary telling.
I am Martha, a single mother to my 2 children, Noah and Sarah. I love them more than anything in this world, and the thought of losing them is unimaginable. They are my babies, and I will do anything to keep them close to me. I cannot bear the idea that someday they will grow up and no longer need me. One night, I came up with a plan to keep my children dependent on me forever. I would remove their arms so that they would need me to push them around in wheelchairs. It was a twisted idea, but I was desperate to keep my children close to me. As I stood between their beds, watching them sleep, I gripped the knife tightly in my hand. I approached Noah first, gently stroking his forehead. His little eyes opened in surprise as I placed my hand over his mouth. And then, without hesitation, I plunged the knife into his spine. I felt the crunch of the bone severing, and Noah screamed a muffled cry into my hand. I twisted the blade before removing it, and he passed out. Sarah was already awake and watched in horror as I mutilated her brother. I approached her with a blood-soaked knife in hand and a crazed stare in my eyes. "It will all be over quick, I promise," I whispered to her. I severed her spine just as I had done with Noah, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. As I stood over their sleeping bodies, I felt a sense of satisfaction that they were now permanently dependent on me. They would never be able to leave my side. I cleaned their wounds and cauterized them, taking care of them as any mother would. As I looked at my children, I realized that removing their arms would be the final step in my plan. It was the only way to ensure they would always need me. But for now, they needed to rest. I kissed them goodnight, knowing that I had clipped their wings and they would never fly away from me. Days passed after I had clipped the wings of my children, and I had to take care of them more than ever. I felt a sense of power and satisfaction in seeing them so dependent on me, so helpless without me. It was a strange feeling, but one that made me feel important and needed. As I tended to their wounds, I realized that my children were growing more independent with each passing day. They were still able to talk and move their upper bodies, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before they would no longer need me at all. It was a thought that terrified me, and I knew I had to take drastic measures to keep them close. One night, as I watched them sleep, I heard a voice in my head urging me to do something more. It told me that I needed to take away their ability to move completely, to make them fully dependent on me. The idea of mutilating my children once again was horrifying, but the voice was right. They needed me, and I needed them. With a newfound sense of purpose, I went to their room with a plan to remove their arms. It would be painful, but it was necessary. I dislocated their shoulders first, making it easier for the arms to tear free from the sockets. I was surprised at how easy it was, and it made me feel powerful. As I cleaned their wounds, I saw the fear in their eyes. They knew that I was the one responsible for their pain, but they couldn't say anything. They were completely at my mercy, and it was a feeling that I couldn't describe. After I had finished taking care of them, I realized that my children were now completely helpless without me. They couldn't move, couldn't even lift their arms. They were dependent on me for everything, and it was a feeling that I couldn't describe. I had severed their spines and removed their arms, and they would never be able to leave me. As I looked at my children, I realized that I was no longer their mother in the traditional sense. I was something else entirely, something dark and twisted. But it didn't matter. As long as they needed me, I was happy. I kissed them goodnight, feeling a sense of satisfaction that I had done everything I could to keep them close to me. With my children completely dependent on me, I felt a sense of power that I had never experienced before. I was their caregiver, their protector, and their everything. But as the days passed, I realized that I needed to do more to keep them close. They were growing more independent with each passing day, and it terrified me. One night, as I watched them sleep, the voice in my head returned, urging me to take their eyes so they would never leave me. I recoiled at the thought, but I knew that the voice was right. If my children couldn't see, they would never be able to leave me. It was a twisted thought, but I couldn't ignore it. The next day, I started preparing to remove their eyes. I knew it would be painful, but it was necessary. I couldn't risk losing them, not now, not ever. As I stood over their sleeping bodies with the scalpel in my hand, I hesitated. Removing their eyes was a step too far, even for me. But the voice in my head grew louder, and I knew that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do this for my children, for their own good. I made the first incision, and my children woke up screaming. I tried to calm them down, but it was too late. I had removed their eyes, leaving them completely blind. They were now completely dependent on me for everything, unable to see or move. But it was a price that I was willing to pay to keep them close. As I tended to their wounds, I realized that I had become something else entirely. I was no longer their mother, but their captor. But it didn't matter. As long as they needed me, I was happy. I had removed their arms and their eyes, and they would never be able to leave me. Days turned into weeks, and my children were completely dependent on me for everything. They couldn't move, couldn't see, and couldn't even feed themselves. But it didn't matter. As long as they needed me, I was happy. But as time passed, I realized that I had created something even more dependent on me than my own children. I had become their everything, and they had become mine. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also strangely comforting. They would never leave me, and I would never leave them. We were together forever, trapped in a twisted reality of my making. As the days turned into weeks, I became more and more obsessed with my children's dependence on me. They were completely blind and unable to move, and they needed me for everything. I was their eyes, their hands, their everything. I couldn't imagine life without them, and I knew that they felt the same way. But one night, as I watched them sleep, the voice in my head returned. It told me that there was one more thing I needed to do to ensure their complete dependence on me. I had to take away their ability to communicate, to make them completely helpless without me. It was a horrifying thought, but I knew that the voice was right. My children needed me, and I needed them. The next day, I prepared to remove their tongues. I knew it would be painful, but it was necessary. I couldn't risk losing them, not now, not ever. As I stood over their sleeping bodies with the scalpel in my hand, I hesitated. Removing their tongues was a step too far, even for me. But the voice in my head grew louder, and I knew that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do this for my children, for their own good. I made the first incision, and my children woke up screaming. I tried to calm them down, but it was too late. I had removed their tongues, leaving them completely unable to speak. They were now completely dependent on me for everything, unable to see, move, or communicate. But it was a price that I was willing to pay to keep them close. As I tended to their wounds, I realized that I had become something else entirely. I was no longer their mother or their captor, but something even darker. But it didn't matter. As long as they needed me, I was happy. I had removed their arms, their eyes, and their tongues, and they would never be able to leave me. But as time passed, I realized that I had gone too far. My children were completely helpless without me, and they were trapped in a world of darkness and pain. I had created something even more dependent on me than I could have ever imagined. They were completely at my mercy, and it was a feeling that I couldn't describe. I knew that I had to live with the consequences of my actions, but I didn't care. My children were my everything, and I would do anything to keep them close, even if it meant destroying their lives and my own in the process. As time passed, my children's world grew smaller and smaller. They were completely dependent on me for everything, and they lived in a world of darkness and pain. I had taken away everything that made them human, and they were now nothing more than creatures that lived in perpetual darkness. I realized too late that I had created a monster that I couldn't control. My children were completely at my mercy, and it was a feeling that I couldn't describe. They were my everything, but they were also my prison. I couldn't leave them, and they couldn't leave me. One day, I woke up to find that my children had passed away in their sleep. They were gone, and I was alone. The house was silent, and the darkness was overwhelming. I realized too late that I had destroyed everything that was good in my life, and I was left with nothing. I was consumed with guilt and remorse, and I knew that I would have to pay for my actions. I turned myself into the authorities, and I was sentenced to life in prison. It was a fitting punishment for the crimes that I had committed. As I sat in my cell, I thought about my children and the life that we could have had. I realized too late that I had been blinded by my obsession with their dependence on me, and I had destroyed everything that was good in my life. In the end, my children's dependence on me had become my own prison. I had become trapped in a world of darkness and pain, and I had taken my children with me. It was a fate that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and I knew that I would have to live with the consequences of my actions for the rest of my life.